This episode of Transmission Interrupted was recorded December 15th, 2025. This is Transmission Interrupted, a podcast series from NETEC, the National Emerging Special Pathogens Training and Education Center. Welcome to Transmission Interrupted from NETEC.
Hello, and welcome to Transmission Interrupted. My name is Jill Morgan. I'm here at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. For those of you not yet familiar with NETEC, our mission is to set the gold standard for special pathogen preparedness and response across health systems in the U.S. with the goals of driving best practices, closing knowledge gaps, and really developing innovative resources. NETEC works alongside and in cooperation with the CDC and is funded by ASPR, the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. Today's episode is going to be all about the hospital EMS interface. And I have with me today two people who live this on the daily. Stefanie Lane, who's the Assistant Director of the Biothreats Program in the Center for Disaster Medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, and Michael Carr with the Emory University School of Medicine, Department of Emergency Medicine, Pre-Hospital and Disaster Section. And I'm super excited to have you guys here. And we're going to talk a lot about sort of where these two teams meet. So welcome.
Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Jill. Great to be here.
So there's going to be some stuff we just can't get to today just from the scope of this. And so I want to start by sort of explaining where we're going to start and hopefully finish. And basically, we're talking about the teams of people who transport high consequence infectious disease patients. These are people who might have or suspected of having something like Ebola or Lassa fever or MERS, something like that. So we understand that this might be a 911 call. There might be transports that are done by aircraft. We're going to set those aside for today. We're really going to talk about either sending or receiving patients from one level of care to another in the hospital setting. And so I think it's really important for us to think about you have a team of people at the hospital who has been caring for this patient or who will be caring for this patient, and you have a team of EMS folks who have to sort of pick this ball up carefully and transport it safely and hand it off again. And I will say, I have my own perspective on all this because as an ER nurse, long before I had ever thought about Ebola or anything else, you're never sure what an EMS team has been through before they bring a patient to you, right? I mean, they might have had to wade through the mud to get somebody out of a car. They might have literally been in a lake or in somebody's house that you don't even want to think about the condition of. And so to me, we always sort of treated our EMS teams as if they were, as the Southern phrase goes, a hot mess, right? But on the flip side, in these situations, you have an EMS team that might be going to pick up a patient from a hospital, and that hospital has been in a crisis, right? They have identified a patient who might have something super scary, and it might be that the EMS team is the clean folks, and that hospital is trying to recover from what might be a really big mess. So it's a very interesting topic. I'm super glad that we get to talk about it today. Perhaps we'll launch into this thinking about the EMS side of things and about how does a team prepare to pick up a suspected or known high consequence infectious disease patient. And even for me, we're going to set aside at least most of the finicky parts of the PPE, right? Y'all know that's my favorite topic. Waste is now up there as a contender, but we're going to put away most of the PPE talk today. But really, how does an EMS team prepare for that? You're called, you're going to have to go pick up this patient. Dr. Carr, can you walk us through what preparing an EMS team looks like for that?
Sure. So whenever I'm thinking about an EMS team engaging with high consequence infectious disease, my first question is, have they been trained before? Have they had any training or exposure to this before? The best possible scenario is that the members of that team or leadership within their agency have participated in a biosafety transport course, like an operator level course where they can get that background information, learn about standard and transmission-based precautions, learn about the bugs of concern, if you will, that they could potentially be exposed to, so that they've had some kind of a background training, because then you're starting with an advantage and you can follow up with some abbreviated just-in-time training to really get them back on track and in the right mindset. So for me personally, I'm always wondering if they've had any type of operational readiness. If not, my level of concern does go up a little bit. I think we need to spend more time with a crew that may not have any background in advance of going to transport this patient. I would say, speaking from, I work at Emory University Hospital as well. We are considered a center of excellence for receiving patients with high consequence infectious disease. There's the SCDU here. There's a lot of resources. So if I'm thinking about an EMS agency that is bringing us a patient, usually we want to make sure that there has been some level of conversation with that agency before they show up on the ambulance ramp, which unfortunately has happened. And then we've got to scramble and try to pull our resources together. In addition to some background knowledge, training, and education, having that communication in advance of doing the patient transport is so essential.
Yeah, it's a great point that I guess I glossed right over, which is thou shalt not spring this on an EMS team when they arrive at your door. Like, this needs to be a conversation that happens way in advance. And luckily, I think in most places we'd have public health involved. We'd have a lot of other stuff going on with these. But stuff does happen, right? And I'm sure that it probably, if it hasn't happened before, it probably will happen, that somebody will get cold called to something like this. So ideally, we'd have a team that's already been through a training course. They know what PPE they're going to wear for the pathogen that's in play here, and they know something about preparing their ambulance. And we won't spend a lot of time on this, but could either one of y'all explain a little bit about what we mean by preparing an ambulance, right? That it may not be that you just have a spare truck that you bring in just for these occasions, although I know there are places that have done that. But for the average ambulance company, what are they doing to make the back of an ambulance ready to put a patient like this in?
Yeah, I'll just kick off on that, Jill, and I'll say that I really think it's based on a risk assessment and having the EMS services understand what that risk assessment is. So do all ambulances need to be prepared or draped in the same way? And I think a lot of that is based on the pathogen of concern, the level of suspicion, the state of the patient. So I think it really goes into that preparation before and thinking about what is the risk to the providers in that moment. And then, Mike, I'll hand it over to you to talk a little bit more about what we do for the ambulances.
Yeah, so I mentioned the training opportunities earlier. Part of that training is learning how to don and doff an ambulance, right? Modifications can be made to the back of an ambulance to guard against those potentially infectious bodily fluids, right? So agencies do it differently. That being said, there's several different types of supplies you can use. But in short, what you're doing is using either a reinforced disposable painter's cloth or 6 mil plastic. I haven't seen too many other supplies in that area of donning an ambulance, but those are basically layered in a very strategic fashion to create a U where the entire inside of the ambulance is covered. Now I'm sitting here and I'm demonstrating with my hands, but realizing I'm going to have to describe this a little bit better for people who are listening and not seeing. But if you picture wrapping the inside of the ambulance in a way so that if a patient vomits or has an explosive diarrhea episode on the walls, it can be quickly mitigated, covered, and then when we terminally clean and disinfect the ambulance after the transport, it can be mitigated and removed in a way that we're containing all of this category A waste so it can be dealt with at a later time.
Yeah, because certainly most EMS companies can't just say, oh, I'm going to have to throw that truck away.
Right. They're
sure
quite expensive.
Probably what people are wishing they could do, but we won't go there. All right. So we've got a team that's hopefully had some notification. They've prepared their truck. And now we think about coming to the hospital. And I want to interject here that if you are a facility of any size and you have an emergency room, you need to think about this. You need to think about where is a safe place for you to hand off a patient like this? You need to think about whether you want an ambulance crew to come all the way into your facility to wherever room or space you've had this patient, or whether you want your team to take a patient out through your facility to an ambulance bay or wherever they could meet them. And it's really important to think about those infrastructures because we still want you to have some safety things in place, right? That in any kind of treatment of high consequence infectious disease patients, we'd want you to have somebody acting as a trained observer, looking for those sites of potential contamination or risk, or somebody drops something that's contaminated. Those are really important. And it doesn't end just because you're going to hand off this patient. In fact, now you've got two teams of people you have to watch. But you also want to think about not interrupting completely hospital operations. And both of y'all are so familiar with like ERs everywhere are chaos. They're always full. There's always people waiting somewhere. And it's not as if you're just going to be able to waltz in through clean, pristine hallways to get to this space. So let's talk about that idea of, and let's just start with you're picking up a patient, right? Instead of sending. So let's say you're picking up this high consequence infectious disease patient. Really, what are the sort of key points for the safety of that EMS team and the patient and hopefully the hospital team as well? So Stefanie, I'm going to throw that to you first.
Yeah.
And then we'll balance this around a little bit.
Absolutely. And this is a huge area to really put some thought into. And a little bit of that forward thinking means a lot in terms of the actual interactions that you'll have. So that handoff isn't just about the patient. It's about aligning expectations. So neither side, EMS or that sending facility, are assuming the other one's reality, because those assumptions can undermine safety. So setting your expectations about PPE, about what an exposure risk might mean, and about the protocols really flips the script and turns it into a moment of collaboration instead of conflict, which I think we can have from both the sending and receiving facilities with EMS. So making sure that from the hospital point of view, you're not thinking about the way that EMS will interact within your facility based on what you want. And I'll say one of the areas that we think about a lot is when you're going to receive the patient, are you going into a potentially contaminated room? And then what are the expectations of bringing that patient out? Is it a fair expectation that EMS will doff like you might do within the facility with your own staff? What does that do to the EMS team? What does that do to the length of the transportation? Does the EMS team aware of that expectation? So really thinking through those assumptions and making sure that the reality is clear on both sides on what will occur during that handoff.
And I was going to add, we talked about the importance of communication before we have this patient handoff, right? And that's at a high level, I think, having communications periodically throughout the year to say, we are going to be your biosafety transport team. If you get a patient with any of these high consequence, suspected or confirmed high consequence infections, we're going to be the ones coming to pick this patient up. Maybe we should try engaging in a few drills so I can walk through exactly what Stefanie described and make sure we're all on the same page. And then, of course, communication before with the specifics of that patient so we can make sure, okay, this patient is a suspected Ebola virus disease. We want to make sure the patient is pre-medicated with Zofran or with, atropine or something to prevent vomiting and diarrhea during the transport. Making sure if that patient has any risk of clinical deterioration, if their airway needs to be established earlier than we may do in the typical clinical setting, those conversations have to be had. Again, it's all about risk mitigation, making sure we're all on the same page and communicating.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so easy to get caught up in the fact that it's a high consequence infectious disease patient that we forget about the basics, which is, do you have an accepting physician? Have you given a good report? Have you made sure this patient's stable for transport or as stable as you can make them for transport? So Stefanie, I love the phrase you used about don't make these assumptions. I think it's important for us to not hand off risk, right? So if I can do something in the hospital to make this patient safer for transport, whether that's in how I package them, right? wrapping them in an impervious sheet or pre-medicating them for nausea or anxiety, or whether that's treating their fever. I want to make sure that I am handing a patient off in the best way possible for the safety of that EMS team. And of course, the safety and well-being of that patient, right? There's a patient at the end of this. But it's also interesting to think about, having watched some of these drills, and Dr. Carr, I think you make a great point. Of course, we want to, and I would expect nothing less than two people who work in a disaster preparedness to be talking about the importance of drilling something ahead of time, because that's, certainly the chapter and verse of disaster medicine is, prepare ahead of time. But, this idea of giving a report, it's so tempting to have people sort of crossing paths or leaning into each other to talk. And if you're all wearing PPE, we want to keep people sort of separated for this. We want you to not just be touching people or bumping into things. And so all of those things that we do so naturally for regular patient handoffs is much harder when you're wearing PPE. You might be having to almost shout to have somebody hear you over the motor of their powered air respirator. So I think there are things that make this so much more complicated and make that training and practice so important. I know that y'all have seen this go really not well, whether it's in a drill or whether it's in some other kind of patient handoff. Stefanie, you mentioned EMS teams actually being expected to come in, put the patient onto their stretcher, and then change out of their PPE. And that was I was gobsmacked by that, because I thought, oh, wow, I can't imagine asking an EMS team to do that. But clearly this is something that people thought, well, gosh, I don't want them tracking things through there. Well, maybe you should have thought about the hospital team taking the patient out rather than EMS coming in. There's got to be a way to do this that doesn't involve having to doff in a dirty area and then try to figure out where you're going to re-don clean PPE, or even if you have a second set of clean PPE.
Yeah. And it's one of those things to think about when hospitals are looking at these handoffs between hospitals and EMS. It really reflects kind of a difference in operational readiness. And so EMS is really looking at that need for mobility, speed, being efficient, while hospitals are more of that mindset of potentially the full barrier precautions. And so I think this goes both ways, because what are your expectations of EMS coming in when you're transferring a patient out, or when you're going into that receiving facility who may have a higher level of experience with these patients? What's the expectation on EMS coming in? So I think back to what Mike was saying, that key communication and the shared training. So both sides understand each other's protocols and can focus on that patient and provider safety rather than those perceived gaps that you have in the moment. Because it is not fun for EMS to be in a position where, one, they weren't necessarily told about an expectation to don and doff PPE, and they are thinking about how to most effectively get the patient out. Or two, if they end up going into a facility where there's a perceived risk and that EMS may not be wearing the type of PPE that receiving facility considers acceptable and not an exposure risk. So those all bring up areas of vulnerability and make it really difficult to have that trust go in both directions.
Yeah, I think about that, what I sort of learned as some of the cardinal rules of emergency response was, is the scene safe? And when you have an EMS team walking in to pick up a high consequence infectious disease patient, they need to be thinking about, is that scene safe? And then when they're dropping off that infectious disease patient that they've now been in intimate contact with, right in the back of a truck, and who knows what's happened back there, now the receiving hospital has to think about how contaminated is that team and that patient. So really thinking about where is best for this handoff to occur, where is safest. And then, gosh, Stefanie, I remember you telling me this story that they were going to hold an ambulance team, an EMS team in a hospital room and not let them leave because they might be contaminated. I can't imagine.
We can avoid that.
Yes,
If we can
please.
avoid that for our EMS providers, if those facilities that are going to be receiving a patient can think through those what ifs, it means a really big deal for those EMS providers to know that they have a place to go, even if those questions are occurring, even if OC Health is getting involved. A perceived or potential exposure needs some time to dig through. So if we can think ahead about giving them their own space, I promise that will go a long way.
Yeah. And Michael Carr is going to say, as medical control, like this has got to be like something that would be just a nightmare for you.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. You raised an excellent point that it's a multidisciplinary conversation that has to happen. It's not just the emergency department and EMS, or let's say the SCDU and EMS. It's EVS, it's all of the different, it's security, right? Especially if you think about what separates a center of excellence from those that are not integrated into that system, it's that all of these different disciplines have had conversations. EVS will have somebody watching anytime the crew touches a door handle, they're sitting there wiping it down with, Sani wipes and making sure it's wet time to make sure that we can have an adequate mitigation of that bio and security. If we're going to have an alternate entrance for a patient outside of the emergency department, we're bringing in the backside of the hospital, for example. Security has to create a secure area that's card access only, where we can't have bystanders, filming everything with their phone. So all these things have to be thought out, and it's outside of the medical realm. There are so many different layers and operations within a hospital system and within EMS that just being involved in medical control in one of these cases, if they have not been conversed in advance, this gives me an immense stressful feeling that I can't describe.
Sorry about that. Yeah, no, I think about like if I could wave a magic wand, like I would love to have people do a handoff where, you put down an impervious sheet and EMS stays on their side and hospital stays on their side and nobody crosses over. And, that way all the dirty stuff can stay on one place and all the clean stuff in theory can stay on the other place. We managed to do this side by side using things like you mentioned, like painter's drop cloth, the impervious sheeting material. It could be a level 4 OR drape, whatever you have at your disposal. But really what you're looking for is something that can catch anything that drops, that keeps people from tracking stuff in and out or anywhere through your facility, and where the EMS team doesn't have to track all the way through what might be a contaminated space if they're picking up a patient, or track contamination through to a biocontainment unit or a receiving facility's clean space, right? So we really want to limit where this, let's just use the phrase, stuff gets spread around a facility. Because again, every ER is busy. Every ER needs to get back to an operating place of maintaining their hospital operations as quickly as possible. And to do that, you can't just be doing this willy-nilly. Yeah.
Same for the EMS providers, because you want to be able to get them back to an operational state as quickly as you can too. And I think that's one of the big things to think about. So if we're keeping those EMS providers and their stuff or their potentially contaminated areas isolated to one space, also thinking through their goal is to kind of see how quickly they can get back on the road because they're pulling a truck off for this. So how can we get them turned around to be back in an operational state as well?
Yeah, no, excellent point. And that actually brings me to this sort of idea of really thinking about, obviously, we've mentioned the importance of training. At this point, this has now been a Joint Commission requirement for every Joint Commission accredited hospital for a year and a half now, I think, to be ready and thinking about these high consequence infectious disease patients. We've had the biosafety transport operators course. We've got an EMS playbook for high consequence infectious diseases. There's a lot of reference material out there now and assistance with training and things like that. We really should be getting to the point where people can be thinking about some of these other details. And I think what will happen to the team? What will happen to your truck? How are you going to bring that back to a ready state for the next patient without putting them at risk? And then it wouldn't be a conversation with me complete without what are we going to do with the trash, right? While not every one of these high consequence patients might generate category A waste, or what's called category A waste, that's a category of waste that requires special treatment and handling. And many of the pathogens that we're talking about would. Now, that's for a confirmed patient. So until you have a confirmed test that says, yes, this patient really does have what you're worried about, you're probably fine sequestering that waste package. But what is y'all's experience? Do hospitals take the EMS waste? Does the EMS company have to find somebody else to take their waste? Who's responsible for all those things?
Well, I can tell you the time not to figure that out is when you drop off a patient at the hospital. And so back to that importance of that drilling and exercise and having those conversations ahead of time, because what we don't want is EMS needing to take that waste back to their quarters, because they absolutely will not have the capabilities to manage category A waste. But it's so key to have those conversations ahead of time.
Yes, there's natural relationships with a hospital and their surrounding EMS agencies. Speaking of our local experience here in Atlanta, Emory works very closely with Grady EMS Biosafety Transport Team. Those relationships exist such that if we're transporting a patient to Emory, that conversation has already been had about what's happening with the waste. Ultimately, I would say whose responsibility? It's ultimately, I think, that center of excellence that's receiving the patient that will ultimately manage their care, that will be responsible for tracing back to make sure, okay, EMS, you gave me all of your waste. We have trained observers who are going to help you decon the ambulance. Let's have a conversation about every touch point that you could have had from the time you picked this patient up, because this patient may be suspected, but right now we're going to treat them as if they are a confirmed positive viral hemorrhagic fever. So, all of those conversations are typically, I would say, prompted on the expert side of the receiving facility.
But let's also say, if you are a sending hospital, guess what's not going to happen? You are not going to be able to bag up your trash and expect the ambulance to take it with the patient. Like, that's just, I don't know of anywhere that's allowed to do that. I think sort of based on the federal guidelines on waste handling, that's probably not allowed. And clearly, state by state, territory by territory can be a little different on waste handling rules. But you need to figure that out before you're neck deep in red bag trash on a Friday of a holiday weekend, and you can't reach the people who would normally answer those questions.
Right. I think leaning on your local public health guidance, as you pointed out, Jill, it is very state specific, but there should be policies and procedures in place to make that happen.
Yeah. And Jill, as you mentioned earlier with that sequestration, how are you buying yourself more time? Because quite often when we're moving these patients, we don't quite know what's up yet. So if you can buy yourself that time with sequestration and you know that waste is in a safe spot until you learn more, that's a huge step in the right direction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that can be just double bagging, securely closing, and making sure it's in a leak-proof barrel and just cordoned off from the rest of your waste. So just know that there are plans. NETEC can certainly give you advice on how to sequester your waste while you are waiting. There are some states and localities that limit how long you can hold it before you have to make a determination. But again, this is stuff you really want to have a conversation with folks about ahead of time.
And I was going to say another layer of complexity, of course, is picking up patients with family members from an airport or from a containment unit, which we see here in Atlanta. The CDC has a quarantine facility at the airport. And what do you do with all the luggage that came with that family? What do you do with family members who had close intimate contact in the last 24 hours with this patient, right? There's a lot of different layers of consideration. Are we going to put the luggage in a biohazard bag and keep it in the back corner somewhere considered waste until we know what to do with it? Who knows? But those are questions that we really need to lean on our public health experts.
Exactly. I love public health. I love the folks that we deal with here in Georgia in public health, and I don't mind telling the world how great I think our public health is. But I throw you guys under the bus all the time, and I do, because it's sometimes very helpful when you're in front of a patient who might not be happy about your decision to say, gosh, I would love to be able to keep your dirty clothes with you, but public health says, because it is, sometimes you just need to diffuse the situation. So I frequently will throw public health at them and say, I, of course, would let you do that, but public health won't let you. But I think it is a great point. We always kidded in the emergency department that somebody came in with like a positive suitcase sign because they were already expecting to be admitted to the hospital. So you knew that they thought they were sick, whether we think they were sick or not. But what you do with that, really important to think about and make sure the receiving hospital is aware that you're carrying with you a suitcase that somebody had with them, because you're probably not going to be able to leave that at the airport or wherever it is or at the other hospital. So great points. It's also important to understand that for the pathogens we're talking about, as Dr. Carr was mentioning, people that might be exposed, we're not isolating people who do not yet have symptoms. So if you have family members, absolutely, you want to make sure that somebody's aware of who was in contact, and because public health will want to do some contact tracing and following up with them to be mindful to they need to be watched for symptoms. But we don't have to worry about isolating people without symptoms. And that's different for our high consequence infectious diseases that we're talking about today versus the one that to me might as well be a high consequence pathogen that's all over the place right now, which is measles, right? Because that's very contagious way before people end up having the kinds of symptoms that would take them to healthcare. So in some ways, the high consequence pathogens have given us a little bit of a break, for which we're grateful. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the importance of training. We've talked about really needing to have a plan for what will happen to your team and your truck and your trash, how you'll package a patient, and where makes sense for the safety of everyone involved to do this kind of very controlled handoff. Please understand that when we are saying this requires training, this is like a very well choreographed dance. And if you haven't had the choreography, if you haven't had the practice, you're going to be out there really with two left feet, and it's going to be a danger for everybody. So I think it's a very important time to emphasize this training. I want to mention a couple resources. Dr. Carr, you mentioned the EMS operators course. Can you say a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so there's a 1-day course and there's a 2-day course. The 1-day course, I think agencies may have the most familiarity with that course. We will do it as a pre-conference workshop at some national conferences. We will also come to specific agencies that have requested the NETEC course. And ultimately, it's didactics, information, followed by hands-on training. Everybody that I've talked to who has taken the course has had a positive experience, and it seems to be, everybody calls it the spacesuit course, of course, because we dress our students up and make sure that they're donning and doffing in the presence of a trained observer. I always say there's maybe 3 or 4 main themes that you really have to take away, no matter what. If you don't remember anything, remember the hierarchy of controls, remember the importance of transmission-based precautions. And everybody says, well, I remember the spacesuits. So, of course, as we always train, that PPE is the last barrier of protection. We want, administrative and environmental changes to happen to also create a barrier to ever being exposed to that high consequence infectious disease.
Yeah, and that's, of course, what planning takes, right? Is knowing what all those other pieces are that are in place. And Steph, I know there's an EMS playbook.
There sure is. So there is an EMS playbook that is out there. We, as the NETEC EMS group, had the opportunity to review and add some revisions in within the past couple of years. So that's a tremendous resource by Asper Tracy that really takes you thinking through the entire life cycle of a mission based on your pathogen. So it's an absolutely amazing tool. Offers up more than just thinking about viral hemorrhagic fevers. And sometimes we really look at VHFs as the capstone because that's sometimes the trickiest to manage and takes the most preparation, but also offers insight on those respiratory HCID as well. So it's a tremendous resource.
Excellent. And then I wanted to mention one other thing. And when we talk about pre-planning and really training with a hospital and EMS together, Some hospitals have put together what New York Health and Hospitals and the New York Fire Department calls their BIT card, their bio-isolation transport card, which is basically like a cheat sheet for an EMS company that shows pictures and gives directions for where to pull your ambulance up and, where to put your trash, and really level sets the expectations on a reference sheet or card, because it might be years, right, in between these episodes. And I know that some people are like, oh gosh, this is so last century. We had Ebola patients here at Emory in 2014. We had Lassa fever in 2015 or 2016. But, the case of Lassa fever in Iowa was just a year ago. We've got a Marburg outbreak in Ethiopia right now. We've had a bunch of other outbreaks of other infectious diseases. And Lassa fever is endemic in a part of the world that probably inhabits close to the United States population, again, in that part where Lassa fever is endemic. And right now we're in Lassa fever season. So I think the risk is out there, and people need to be realistic that whether you're ready or not, it could come.
And give me a picture any day. So give me a one-pager with a picture that shows me where to go. As someone who tends to be a little on the wordy side, ain't nobody got time for that. So absolutely with the BIT cards, just show me what to do as clearly as you can. So I think that's an amazing resource.
So we'll have links to those resources in these podcast notes. So please find those and use them. I want to thank you guys. I think that this is a topic we could probably go on and on and on about. I think we could spend a whole day talking about just how to package a patient, or what if somebody puts somebody in an isopod or another type of containment device, and that gets complicated fast too. But really starting with some basics, I think, is a great place to at least get the conversation started. So if you are working at a hospital, urgent care, for heaven's sakes, please think about whether you're prepared for this. Think about what relationships you have with EMS agencies. And likewise, if you're an EMS agency, no matter where you are, whether you're out in rural United States, whether you're in an urban setting, you need to think about what resources you have, what training might be available to you, and really think about how you will react if this is a call that happens on your shift, and how you can be best prepared to protect yourself. Nobody wants to take any of these things home. So we want everybody to be safe out there. All right. Any last comments, things you really want to get across today?
Yes, do the readiness assessment. So there are resources. You can do a readiness assessment that's available. If you're thinking, I work at an EMS agency, I've never heard or seen anything like this before. There's very strategic questions that you can walk through based on the size, the location of your agency, that will tell you whether or not you're ready, and will also connect you with an expert who's going to basically review your agency's scenario, and will connect you with appropriate resources that are out there. They're available and they're free. So use them.
Excellent.
Great plug for the EMS readiness assessment. And we are absolutely ready and waiting to receive those and offer some feedback. I'd also just say that HCID, patient care, transport, all that goes into dealing with HCID patients is a really vulnerable time for both the patient, but also for the providers. So making sure to recognize that, think about not having those assumptions goes a long way for both the receiving and the transporting parties. So
excellent. Absolutely. Well, I hope that I can have you guys back and we'll talk about maybe some more details of this. I think about bringing in some of our pediatric partners and talking about how complicated this gets if you have a parent and child, or just a child, or you have somebody who's really wet. How would you package them? There's so much that we could dive into. And I'm so grateful that for y'all sharing those resources. Again, we'll make sure that they're in these podcast notes so that people can avail themselves. And always, I really want to just thank you guys for sharing your knowledge and experience. And the idea of getting shut inside an isolation room after I've doffed my PPE is just more than I can think about, Steph. So I'm really glad you shared that story. But good grief, that alone should drive people somewhere for training and preparedness, because that's really scary. All right. Well, thank you guys. Stefanie Lane, Michael Carr, I so appreciate your expertise today. For those of you listening at home, thank you for tuning into this episode on the hospital EMS interface. We hope you'll join us for future episodes on a wide range of topics: healthcare worker safety, EMS, personal protective equipment, infectious diseases of all kinds. So if you have any questions for NETEC, ideas about future shows, more questions about EMS, feel free to contact us at info@netec.org. You can find us on the web at netec.org/podcast, where you can subscribe to future episodes and find out more about today's topic, including all those great resources. So we'll see you next time on Transmission Interrupted.
You've been listening to Transmission Interrupted, a NETEC podcast, produced and edited by Benjamin Madsen, with additional support provided by Britton Clark, Veronica Lavaro, Jason Noble, and Lisa Stone. Special thanks to our guests and the subject matter experts at NETEC for their insight and guidance. This podcast is supported by the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. For more information, tools, and training on special pathogen preparedness, visit netec.org. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for tuning in to Transmission Interrupted.